And again, when you look at some of the works here, there is, and look at your other work that you've produced before, there always seems to be a sort of a fusion between science and art. You seem to be incredibly knowledgeable about certain scientific processes, but maybe apply them as I don't want to say dilettantic because that sounds so pejorative, but in an more amateur way. But you are using lots and lots of different scientific methods. How important is that kind of fusion for you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually know a lot about it, and I know there was one, I did do a work that was sort of about, loosely about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and I learned my lesson by talking about it, like talking as if I knew what it was about, and there was a physicist in the audience who then asked a question and corrected me, so I know better than to get too deep into that. But I mean, the uncertainty principle is something that I sort of understand. What I'm interested in, it's a theory that explains how subatomic particles behave. But what's interesting to me is how that can be applied as a metaphor for how things behave in the real world. This idea that when you observe something, you change something, which for me, I guess changes from something which is a very sort of complex, discussion in physics. Because whatever photons are released by the particle, when the photon enters your eye, that means it changes the momentum or direction of the particle. But what's interesting to me is this idea that on a real physical level, this idea that when you look at something, you change it. And I guess that becomes something that's more literary or poetic. But there's also the whole sort of process of scientific investigation, which is, basically the scientific method and experimentation, which is really interesting to me as a way of working. And I think that sort of repeated experimentation to understand the truth. I mean, I always think of those graphs in science class in high school where, you do the experiment, and because of whatever, your measurements aren't perfect, the dot is never exactly where it's supposed to be, the point, but then you draw the line sort of between the dots, and that's where the law lies, the scientific law. And that sort of space between the line and the dots in the graph is what's really interesting to me. And that's where there's this subjectivity, that's where there's this sort of messiness, that's where the world comes in. And I think that whole method is something that is connected to artists who work serially, like Monet working serially, trying to understand the facade of Rouen Cathedral. I think that there is something very scientific, and my scientific interest, I think, is much more 19th century or even 18th century, where there were people, there were a lot of artists who were also scientists, and people could do, did both things, and there wasn't this sort of separation, there wasn't this sort of, dichotomy that there is now, and also people are so specialized now that, I think it really would be impossible now to be a serious artist and a serious scientist at the same time.
But yet you take certain methodologies, the whole measuring,
it's beautiful.
Mapping, tracking, archiving, cataloging, it's very much like a scientist, that sort of sense of order. And yet at the same time I feel you almost sabotage it, or because I think in your work there's always that it's the attempt to capture a moment in space and time. But what I find so particularly engaging and involving and charming also about your work is that often there is an inbuilt sense of failure or the elusiveness of the moment,
right,
and the impossibility of capturing something truthfully,
right,
in spite of using all these very concise methods. Ultimately, this elusive moment is uncapturable, or this is what I feel.
Yeah, well, I think the work I like most is work that sort of calls into question its own viability or its own truth. And it reminds me of the quotation that we discussed and was finally put in the Folkestone catalog, which is, I'm not sure I'm going to remember it correctly, but it's the quote from Beckett where he says, there are many ways in which the thing I am trying in vain to say may be tried in vain to be said. And
or fail and fail better.
Yeah.
Was another, yes.
This idea that, if you're trying to approach some sort of truth or representation, and in the sense, since all this work is representational, it is this attempt toward some sort of truth. But you also realize that it's a vain attempt, and you just keep trying. I mean, there's this sort of this real sort of I don't know, compulsion or obligation or something.
You also try different methods. I mean, the point about it seeming to draw on the scientific method is very valid, but it's almost like you're from a parallel world. Before art kind of went on its own path and science went on its own complicated path, and it's kind of an earlier moment where there was more experimentation and trying different methods. Can you say something about the kind of rules that you apply, because that's related? So, like with the piece about the bees, you were very insistent that they be hung in sequence according to the time that you made the readings, whereas the studio piece at the beginning is in principle similar, but you don't mind mixing them up, so you don't follow chronology there. So you're sort of setting up rules, but it's not rigorous, or it's not applied across the piece.
Yes, I mean, it's kind of inconsistent, and I don't really, I know when we were speaking about it earlier, I tried to sort of figure it out. I mean, I think this, because it is about this sort of discrete period of following these bees and keeping track of them, it makes sense, because it's more, I guess this is more diachronic in a way, and so there is a sense of it having to sort of exist in time, and this being this sort of seriality referring to that passage of time. Whereas with the paths through the studio, which are, it's the same thing, it's these sort of traces, these paths, I think of it as more graphic, and sort of thinking about the sort of architecture of the space and how on different days I moved through it differently, and it didn't need to be chronological. And also that piece, I was really thinking of it as one sort of big visual work in that wall as one thing together like that, as sort of more graphically. But
well, like in colour, because often, I mean, you're well known for works where you're so sort of hyper precise about the quality of colour, and then there's this. It's like sort of sacrilege, isn't it? It's not. It doesn't. There's no correspondence between the colour and the temperature. So what do you call it? False colour images. Deliberately the opposite of specific. Which is very interesting that you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess because it is false color, I felt that there's a sort of freedom to be arbitrary, because I sort of against any sort of attempt to make a sort of visual correlation to something that's invisible.
So,
I mean, to say, hot is red and cold is blue, and then so it's a convention that I guess I wasn't so interested in perpetuating, which actually goes back, if I think about those smell drawings of the Gowanus Canal, the only rule I had was that the color could not look like the canal, which is a very sort of fetid, like green, disgusting color. So the only color I didn't allow myself to use was the color that was actually connected to, that sort of made a visual connection. And since I didn't want there to be a visual connection, I felt this idea of false color, which is a sort of beautiful idea, because all color actually is false because it's subjective in some way. I felt sort of free to sort of to dispense with the sort of conventions that are normally used for false color images of, say, medical scans or radio telescope views of the universe.
But I think the whole area of colour is obviously so central to your work, and there are so many questions connected to it. So, for example, the whole colour theory, from going back to Newton's optics to Goethe's Farbenlehre, or Johannes Itten's writings about colour at the Bauhaus, but also somebody like who's a bit more left field, like Nabokov, and his sort of do you call it synesthesia?
He called it colored hearing.
Mixing the senses. So he had, wasn't it the alphabet, and he assigned a color to each. He could see a color with each alphabet. But when you talk about smelling color, or that whole psychological undercurrent of the perception of color and the associations of color, seems to be something that is quite prevalent in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are two things. I mean, I love crackpot theories of color. I mean, I find it so compelling, especially when people really think really think they've figured it out. Like Goethe thought he really had figured it out. And, I mean, his color theory is a crackpot theory. It's not, I mean, yellow does not represent, there's no reason to associate yellow with melancholy or whatever. So, but within that, there are these incredibly beautiful moments of
spectrum.
And talking about the beauty of color, and so in addition to this sort of conceptual interest in color, which I think came originally from reading Wittgenstein's Remarks on Color, which was really not, I mean, it's not something an artist would really use because it was really about this sort of ideas about color and language, and which was so fascinating to me, and I think sort of freed me in a lot of ways. At the same time, the more I work with it, the more I really love certain colors, and I love, I love just looking at certain colors, like this painting in Rome I saw last summer, the Velázquez painting of Pope Innocent, is this painting with all of this red, and it's just so exciting for me to look at all the reds in that painting. Or like one color like this orange color here, I love so much. It's such a beautiful color. So I mean, there's and also this putty color somehow.
And you were saying about this work that it relates to all the different. Each color stands for a particular temperature taken on your
So there's a little legend here. So this is the exact size of the window in the studio. So it's 2 separate windows, and then there are 17 thermometers taped to each window, so I could record the temperature and then sort of break it down into these shapes based on the temperature. And then there's a little legend here at the bottom that indicates what temperature each color stands for.
So on the one hand, there are these quite almost rigid rules that you apply. On the other hand, again, you torpedo that by the sort of randomness that comes with.
Kind of beginning to understand that the colours don't have any inherent meaning or significance, but they are carriers for meaning and significance. But you kind of apply them to different purposes, don't you? I mean, it's certainly like what you say about it, the colour theory, where yellow means something specific. You won't have any trouble with that, but you use it as a metaphorical tool, I guess, but apply it differently.
Yeah, especially when it's being applied to represent something you can't see.
Yeah,
exactly. But then there are these very strong colors next to these beautiful sort of pastel hues, and upstairs is another very interesting series of drawings, which is of the shape. You repeat it again. It's a series of a leak in your ceiling.
Yeah.
So it's obviously a leak color, so rusty, browny, reddy thing, but it's almost like a Rorschach test where you see different shapes in each one. So the titles in general seem to be very important, as well as the sort of psychological seam that seems to run through a lot of your work.
Yeah. Well, I think titles are important because one of the difficulties I have is taking work that looks abstract and trying to help people get into it and see that it's actually not abstract, that it's actually something very specific. And the only way I found that really allows this is either captioning on drawings or a title. And so that there's this, I sort of hope that people sort of see it as abstract first and then sort of enter into it and realize that there's this whole other level, and that there be this sort of back and forth between those two things, between this very, very specific representation of something, moment or place, and then at the same time something that's purely just abstract color.
Another thing about your work that I find completely fascinating, and this room doesn't quite prove what I'm about to say, is the incredible spectrum and wealth of materials that you work with. I mean, here it's much more the photography and the drawing, But upstairs there's a train, which sort of is, I guess, a first for you. But then you've worked with apples falling, and you've worked with rhinestone and with gels and balloons, a vast array of materials. And it seems, how does it suggest to you? Is it in each case the situation itself that suggests different materials?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just my sort of background and training, is that you just sort of find. I remember when I had this sort of epiphany that, you know, that material could have so much meaning, and so the idea that there are certain materials that are appropriate for certain ideas, and that the material itself should contribute to the meaning of the work. And I mean, of course, there are all at the same time there are certain conventions, and people know how to look at watercolors, and watercolors have conventions, but in other works it really makes sense to have a different material that has intrinsic meaning, that contributes to the meaning of the final artwork.